Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. It was one of those nights where we were all too bored for our own good. You know the type. Nothing to watch, nowhere to go, and a restless energy that makes you want to try something new, no matter how dumb it sounds. That's how we ended up with a Ouija board on my living room floor. There were 4 of us. Me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Mike and Chris. None of us really believed in the whole ghost hunting thing, but Sarah had been talking about the board ever since she found it at some thrift store last week. It looked old. The kind of thing you'd imagine had been passed down through generations, and honestly, it gave me the creeps just looking at it. Still, I didn't want to be the one to kill the vibe, so we all agreed to give it a shot. Mike, as usual, was the one egging everyone on. Come on, it's just a board game. What's the worst that could happen? A couple of cheap scares, and then we'll laugh it off. He was always the skeptic, but I could tell even he was a little on edge. We dimmed the lights, lit a few candles for effect, and sat in a circle around the board. Sarah placed her hands on the planchette first, her eyes wide with excitement. "All right, let's see if we can find anything," she said, trying to hide the nerves creeping into her voice. I followed her lead, and so did Mike and Chris. At first, it felt kind of silly. We asked the usual questions. "Is anyone here? What's your name?" And got nothing but silence. After about 10 minutes of nothing happening, Mike sighed and leaned back. "All right, well, that was a bust. Let's order pizza." But just as we were about to give up, the planchette moved. Slowly, deliberately. We all froze, our fingers barely touching the wooden piece as it slid across the board. Mike shot me a glance, as if silently accusing me of being the one to move it. I wasn't, though. None of us were. You could feel it in the room, the kind of tension that makes you realize this isn't a joke anymore. The planchette spelled out something strange. WWWW. We stared at it, confused. Chris frowned. "Wait, what? Is this thing trying to give us a web address?" Mike scoffed. "Yeah, right. A ghost with internet access." But the planchette moved again. DARK. Dark, Sarah whispered, her hand trembling slightly on the planchette. It didn't stop. WEB. I could feel my stomach twist into knots. Dark web. That wasn't the kind of response we were expecting. In fact, it wasn't the kind of thing anyone should be expecting from a Ouija board. We all just sat there, staring at the letters, unsure of what to do next. "Okay," Mike said, breaking the silence. "Someone's messing with us. One of you moved it, right?" None of us answered. Sarah shook her head, her eyes locked on the board. "I didn't move it." Another minute of silence passed before Chris spoke up. "Do we follow it?" "Are you nuts?" I said, a little more forcefully than I intended. "That's the dark web. It's not some random website you can just hop onto. It's..." Before I could finish, Mike stood up and grabbed his laptop from the coffee table. "Look, it's probably just some weird coincidence. Or maybe the board's broken, but I'm curious. Let's see if there's anything to this." Sarah shot me a look that said she was as freaked out as I was, but she didn't stop him. None of us did. I think, deep down, we were all too curious for our own good. Mike opened his laptop and started typing, digging through various Tor browser settings. The rest of us sat there in tense silence as the glow from his screen illuminated the room. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a site hidden deep in the dark web. No name, just a string of random letters and numbers. "I'm in," Mike said, his voice flat. "This is weird. There's no description, no images, nothing. Just a single button that says, 'Enter.'" I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything about this felt wrong. "Mike, I don't think this is a good idea." He ignored me. Of course he did. He clicked the button. For a second, nothing happened. The page loaded slowly, as if it was being dragged from some far corner of the internet, and then the screen went black. Just when I thought the site had crashed, text began to appear, letter by letter, like someone was typing it in real time. "Welcome to the forum." We all leaned in closer, our faces reflected in the glow of the screen. More text followed. "You have been chosen to join. Do not exit the page. Do not leave your house until instructed." Mike glanced up at us, a nervous smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Okay, this is definitely some kind of prank. Someone's messing with us. But as soon as he tried to close the browser, the text changed again, as if reacting to his movement. "Do not try to leave. We are watching." Sarah gasped, backing away from the screen. "Turn it off. Seriously, Mike, this isn't funny anymore." Mike tried again, slamming the laptop shut this time. But as soon as he did, we heard it. A loud thud from somewhere upstairs. It wasn't the kind of noise you could ignore. It was deliberate, almost like someone had dropped something heavy on the floor above us. We all stared at each other, the color draining from our faces. That's probably just the pipes," I muttered, though I didn't believe it for a second. Then another thud, this time closer. Mike opened the laptop again, his hands shaking now. The screen flickered back to life, and there it was, the same text, but this time it was different. "We told you not to leave." I could feel my heart racing. This was wrong, all of it. The Ouija board, the website, the noises from upstairs. None of this was supposed to happen. Another thud, this one directly above us. I stood up, every instinct telling me to get out, but something kept me there. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way the room seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. Whatever it was, none of us moved. Then the final message appeared on the screen. "Do not look up." We all froze. The ceiling above us creaked, slowly, like something was shifting its weight. And that's when I realized we weren't alone in the house. The ceiling creaked again, a long, drawn-out sound that sent chills down my spine. None of us dared to move. Sarah's hand gripped my arm, her fingers digging in hard, but I barely noticed. My eyes were glued to the laptop screen, the words, "Do not look up," burning into my brain. Mike swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" "I don't know, but this isn't some prank," I muttered, my pulse racing. "Something's wrong, we need to—" Thud. The noise came from right above us this time, directly over the living room. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was heavier, like something was being dragged across the floor. Slow, deliberate. Chris stood up, his face pale, his eyes darting between us and the ceiling. "We need to check upstairs. Maybe someone broke in." "Are you out of your mind?" Sarah hissed, pulling him back down. "Did you not see what the screen said? It told us not to look up." I didn't want to agree with her, but she was right. Every instinct was screaming at me to stay put, to not make any sudden movements. Whatever was up there, we had no idea what we were dealing with. And the fact that it had somehow connected with us through both the Ouija board and the dark website. None of this made sense, but it was real. Too real. Mike, being Mike, couldn't resist. "You guys are freaking out over nothing. Someone's probably hacked into the laptop and is messing with us." He stood up, giving us a nervous grin. "I'll go check upstairs. Whoever's doing this is about to get the scare of their life." Before any of us could stop him, he started walking toward the stairs. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to stop him." But it was too late. Mike was already halfway up the stairs, moving slowly but determined. The rest of us sat frozen, listening to his footsteps as they disappeared into the hallway above. The house was eerily quiet now, the kind of silence that makes every creak and groan seem 10 times louder. Then came the sound of Mike's voice, calling down to us from upstairs. "Guys, you need to see this." Chris and I exchanged a glance, and against my better judgment, I stood up. "What is it?" "Just come up here," Mike replied, his voice sounding distant, strained. "There's something you need to see in the hallway." I didn't like the way he said it. Something in his tone was off, like he was forcing himself to stay calm. I looked back at Sarah, who shook her head furiously. "Don't go up there," she whispered. "Please." But Chris was already heading toward the stairs, and I couldn't let him go up there alone. I gave Sarah a reassuring nod, even though I didn't believe it myself, and followed Chris up the stairs, my heart pounding with each step. The upstairs hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. Mike was standing near the end of the hall, staring at the ceiling. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at. Everything seemed normal. No signs of a break-in, no movement, nothing. But then I noticed it. A message, written in what looked like dark, oily streaks, scrawled across the ceiling above Mike's head. "You looked up." My stomach dropped. Chris took a step back, his eyes wide with shock. "What? How is that even possible?" Mike just stood there, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I took a few cautious steps closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The letters were smeared, almost like they had been written with some kind of thick black liquid. And the worst part, the streaks were fresh, still dripping. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Right now." Mike shook his head, his eyes still locked on the ceiling. I don't understand. It's like it knew what I was going to do." "Mike, come on," I said, grabbing his arm. "We can figure this out later. We have to leave." He didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. His eyes were wide, glazed over like he was in some kind of trance. And then he started mumbling. "They're watching us." "What?" Chris asked, stepping closer. "They're watching us," Mike repeated, his voice low and hollow. "I can feel them. They're waiting for us to look." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Mike, who's watching us?" "The Watchers," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're always watching. They don't want us to leave." Suddenly, there was another thud, this time from the hallway closet. We all jumped, our nerves on edge. Chris moved toward the closet door, his hand hovering over the handle. "Maybe there's someone in there," he whispered, glancing back at me. "No," I said quickly, backing away. "We don't need to check. We need to go." But Chris wasn't listening. He grabbed the handle and yanked the closet door open. There was nothing inside, just darkness. But as soon as the door swung open, the air in the hallway shifted. It felt heavier, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. And then we heard it. A voice. Faint, raspy, coming from somewhere deep inside the house. "Stay." Chris backed away from the closet, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, too terrified to speak. The voice had come from the dark, from somewhere we couldn't see, but it was clear now. This wasn't just some hack, some prank. Whatever we had contacted, whether through the Ouija board or the dark web forum, it was real, and it didn't want us to leave. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and we were plunged into complete darkness. I heard Sarah scream from downstairs, and panic set in. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic here, only fear. I grabbed Mike's arm again, pulling him toward the stairs. "We have to get out of here now." He didn't resist this time, following me down the stairs with Chris right behind us. The house felt different now, like it was alive, like the walls were closing in on us. Every step we took echoed through the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, watching us. We reached the living room, where Sarah was standing by the door, her face pale with fear. "What's happening? What did you see?" "We need to leave," I said, fumbling with the front door lock. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn it. "Something's in the house." I threw the door open, and we all rushed outside, gasping for air, as if we had just escaped a suffocating nightmare. The cool night breeze hit my face, and for a moment I felt a sliver of relief, but then I heard it, a soft whisper carried by the wind. They're still watching. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in the upstairs window, was a shadowy figure, tall, thin, with glowing eyes that burned through the darkness. And it was smiling. We didn't go back inside. We couldn't. Instead, we sat huddled together on the porch, too scared to move, too freaked out to talk about what had just happened. The night air felt cold against my skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the window, those glowing eyes, that twisted smile. It had been watching us. Sarah was sitting beside me, her legs pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She hadn't said a word since we left the house. Chris, who usually had some smart-ass comment for every situation, was just as silent, his eyes darting toward the windows every few seconds, like he expected something to leap out at us. Mike, though, was different. He hadn't stopped muttering since we got outside, his words barely audible, as if he was talking to himself. It was like he was still in some kind of trance, his mind stuck on the things he'd seen. "They're watching us. They're always watching," he repeated, his voice distant, hollow. I reached out and grabbed his shoulder. "Mike, snap out of it. We need to figure out what's happening. What did you see in the house?" He blinked, slowly coming back to reality. For a moment, he looked at me like he didn't recognize me, like I was a stranger. Then his eyes shifted, and the confusion cleared, replaced by something darker. "It's not just one of them," he whispered, his voice trembling. "There's more, a lot more. They're everywhere." "What do you mean, everywhere?" Sarah finally spoke, her voice shaky. Mike swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the house. "It's like they're all around us, in the walls, in the shadows. They're part of the house, or maybe the house is part of them. I don't know, but I could feel them. They want us to see. They want us to look." The words hung in the air, and I felt the weight of them settle on my chest. This wasn't just about the dark web or the Ouija board anymore. We had tapped into something else, something we couldn't understand, and it had latched onto us. "We need to go," Chris said, standing up abruptly. "We can't stay here. We need to get as far away from this place as possible." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Whatever this was, it wasn't just tied to the house. It had followed us from the moment we contacted it. We'd opened a door, and now it wouldn't close. Still, getting out seemed like the only option. We had to try. I stood up, pulling Sarah to her feet, and we made our way to the car parked in the driveway. Mike and Chris followed closely behind, but Mike kept glancing back at the house, like he expected something to come out of the shadows and drag him back inside. As I fumbled with the keys, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel it, that sensation of being watched. Slowly, I turned around, my eyes scanning the windows, the darkened porch, the yard. And then I saw it. At the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, there were figures. Dozens of them. They stood in the darkness, just shadows, their glowing eyes staring directly at us. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Do you see them?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Sarah turned to look, her hand flying to her mouth as she let out a strangled gasp. Chris and Mike followed, their faces draining of colour as they saw what I saw. "They're here," Mike whispered, his voice shaking. "They're all here." The figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching, waiting. I didn't know what they wanted, but I had the sickening feeling that if we stayed here any longer, we'd find out. I grabbed Sarah's hand and practically shoved her into the car. Chris and Mike scrambled into the back seat and I slammed the door shut, fumbling with the keys as I tried to start the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition, but after what felt like an eternity, the car roared to life. We sped down the street, leaving the house behind us. But even as we put distance between ourselves and that cursed place, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really escaped. We drove in silence for a long time, the weight of what we'd seen hanging over us like a storm cloud. I didn't know where we were going. I just needed to keep driving, to put as much space as possible between us and whatever was out there. But no matter how far we went, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still watching us. "We can't run from this," Mike said quietly from the back seat. "They're part of us now." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had seen something that had broken him, something he couldn't unsee. "What are you talking about?" Chris snapped, his voice cracking with fear. "We're getting out of here. We'll go to the police. We'll figure this out." Mike shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. It's not just the house. They're in us, in our minds. Wherever we go, they'll follow." Sarah's hand tightened around mine, her face pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. "There has to be something we can do. There has to be a way to stop this." But Mike didn't answer. He just stared out the window, his expression empty. We kept driving, not saying much, until we reached the edge of town. I pulled into a gas station parking lot, needing a moment to gather my thoughts to figure out what to do next. The car's engine hummed quietly, the only sound in the still night. That's when I noticed it. A faint tapping. At first, I thought it was just the engine cooling down, the metal contracting in the cold night air. But then I realized it was coming from the car itself, from the roof. My heart stopped. Tap, tap, tap. Sarah's eyes widened, her face draining of color as she heard it too. Chris and Mike froze in the back seat, their eyes locked on the ceiling. "What is that?" Chris whispered, his voice barely audible. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the rearview mirror, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the reflection, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. Their glowing eyes stared back at me, their twisted grins spreading across their faces as they leaned closer to the car. And then, as if they could sense my fear, the tapping stopped. But the silence didn't bring relief. It brought something worse. A single whisper, faint but unmistakable, filled the car. "Look up." We sat frozen in the car, the silence pressing in on us like a heavy weight. The whisper echoed in my mind. "Look up." Every nerve in my body was screaming to ignore it, to keep my eyes glued to the road ahead. But I could feel their presence, those figures with their glowing eyes, lingering just above us. It felt like the car was shrinking, the roof pressing down, as if whatever was up there was just waiting for us to break. "I'm not looking," Chris whispered from the back seat, his voice barely audible. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than any of us. "I'm not looking." The air inside the car had become suffocating, thick with fear. I could feel sweat dripping down the back of my neck, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Sarah hadn't moved. She was staring straight ahead, her breath shallow and quick. Mike was in the same dazed state, staring out the window as if he could see something we couldn't. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping started again, louder this time, more insistent. I clenched my teeth, my body tense with the effort it took to keep from glancing up. The figures were still there. I could feel them, waiting. Then the car door locks clicked. All at once, they locked and unlocked, like someone, or something, was trying to get in. Sarah let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to the door handle as if to keep it shut, but I grabbed her wrist before she could touch it. "Don't!" I hissed. "Don't open the door!" The locks clicked again, faster now, more erratic. The tapping on the roof continued, each hit growing harder, more deliberate. My heart was pounding in my chest, every muscle in my body locked in place. I could hear Chris muttering under his breath, his words a jumble of panic. "We need to get out of here," he whispered. "We need to run." I shook my head, refusing to look away from the road ahead. "Run where? They're everywhere." For a long moment, no one moved. The tapping stopped. The locks fell silent. And for a brief, fleeting second, I thought maybe we'd beaten it. Maybe whatever was outside had gotten bored, moved on, or decided we weren't worth the trouble. But then the windshield cracked. It wasn't a small crack either. It spiderwebbed across the glass in an instant, a deep, shuddering impact that seemed to come from nowhere. Sarah screamed, Chris cursed, and I flinched, pulling my hands back from the steering wheel like it had just burst into flames. Something had hit the windshield. Hard. My first instinct was to throw the car into reverse and floor it, but then I realized what had caused the crack. A hand. A black, shadowy hand was pressed against the glass from the outside, its long fingers splayed out, the tips barely visible through the shattered patterns of the windshield. And behind the hand, I could see them. The figures. They were surrounding the car now, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness, their grins wide and grotesque. There were so many of them, more than I could count, more than I wanted to count. "They're everywhere," Mike whispered, his voice breaking the tense silence. He wasn't even looking at the windshield. His gaze was locked on the side window, where another figure had appeared, its face pressed up against the glass, watching him. I couldn't breathe. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but where could we go? These things had followed us from the house, from the dark web forum, from the Ouija board. There was no escaping them. "We can't just sit here," Chris muttered, his voice shaking. "We have to do something." I didn't know what to say. I was frozen in place, unable to make sense of what was happening, of what we'd unleashed. But then Sarah did something that snapped us all back to reality. She grabbed the laptop. "Wait!" I shouted, but it was too late. She had already opened it, her hands trembling as she pulled up the dark web browser again. "What are you doing?" Chris asked, his voice a mix of fear and disbelief. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this all started with that stupid site. Maybe we can end it there too." It sounded crazy, but we were desperate. I leaned closer, watching as Sarah navigated back to the forum. The same forum that had first given us the warning. The screen flickered for a moment before the familiar text appeared. "You have been chosen." Sarah hesitated, her finger hovering over the trackpad. "What do I do?" I didn't have an answer. The figures outside weren't moving, but they weren't leaving either. Their glowing eyes burned into us from every angle, their grins widening with each passing second. They were waiting for something. Sarah took a deep breath and typed, "What do you want from us?" For a moment, nothing happened. The screen was blank, the air thick with tension. Then, slowly, new text began to appear. "You looked. Now you belong to us." Sarah's face went pale. "Belong to them? What does that even mean?" Before anyone could answer, the windshield shattered completely. Glass flew everywhere, and I barely had time to shield my face as the hand that had been pressed against the glass reached inside, clawing at the air, reaching for us. "Drive!" Chris screamed from the back seat, his voice cracking with terror. I didn't think. I just slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching forward with a screech of tires. We tore out of the parking lot, speeding down the empty highway, the wind whistling through the broken windshield. But the figures didn't disappear. They followed us. Even as we sped down the road, they were still there, in the rearview mirror, keeping pace with the car. Their glowing eyes never blinked, never wavered. It was like they were part of the darkness itself, like we were driving through them. "They're still here!" Sarah shouted, panic rising in her voice. I didn't know what to do. I kept driving, my mind racing, but there was no outrunning them. They were everywhere. And then, from the laptop, a new message appeared on the screen. "There is no escape." Suddenly, Mike grabbed the laptop from Sarah, his eyes wild. "We need to ask it how to stop this." Sarah tried to grab it back, but Mike had already started typing. "How do we end this? How do we make you leave us alone?" The car swerved as I tried to focus on the road and the figures behind us, but then the answer appeared. "Give us what we want." Mike blinked, his hands trembling. What? What do they want?" Before we could even ask, the answer came through. A life. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. I felt my stomach drop. "A life," Chris echoed, his voice barely audible. Mike's face went pale as he stared at the screen. "They want one of us." The car was silent, save for the wind whistling through the shattered windshield. Outside, the figures continued to follow us, their eyes glowing, their grins never fading. They weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. One of us had to die. We thought we could escape. We thought there was a way out. But now it's clear that the only way to end this is to give them what they want. And the worst part is, I don't know if any of us are willing to make that choice. The road stretched out endlessly before us, but I knew it wouldn't matter how far or how fast we drove. There was no escaping them. The figures, the watchers, were still in the rear-view mirror, keeping pace with us, their glowing eyes burning into the back of my head. And now we knew what they wanted. A life. No one said a word, but I could feel the weight of the realization settling over us like a heavy fog. The laptop sat in Mike's lap, the message still on the screen, as if taunting us with the decision we didn't want to make. Sarah's breath hitched beside me. What do we do?" My throat felt dry. I didn't know. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my mind racing. How had it come to this? All we wanted to do was mess around with a Ouija board, maybe get spooked a little. We never expected it to lead here, to this nightmare where the only way out was a sacrifice. Mike's eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. We can't just give them someone, right?" His voice wavered, barely more than a whisper. "There's got to be another way." But deep down, I knew the truth. The watchers had been clear. They weren't leaving without a price. Chris, who had been quiet since we'd fled the gas station, suddenly spoke up from the back seat, his voice low and hollow. Maybe they're bluffing. Maybe if we just keep driving, they'll go away." I glanced in the rear-view mirror. The figures were still there, closer now, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard lights. They weren't going anywhere. "They're not bluffing," I muttered, my voice tight with fear. "They'll keep coming." Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "We can't do this. We can't choose." Mike was silent, his hands trembling as he stared at the screen. His face was pale, drained of all color, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. He was trying to think of something, anything that would save us. But there was no solution, no loophole, no escape. Finally, Mike looked up, his voice barely a whisper. What if it doesn't have to be one of us?" We all turned to him, confusion and fear written across our faces. "What do you mean?" I asked. Mike swallowed hard. "We've been running for hours. What if someone else stumbles across them? Someone else could take our place. We could—" "No," Sarah snapped, her voice breaking. "We're not doing that. We're not dragging some innocent person into this." I wanted to agree with her. I wanted to believe there was some other way. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror again, I knew time was running out. The figures were closer, their faces twisted into those horrible, unnatural grins, their eyes glowing brighter with each passing second. They were waiting. And then it hit me. The choice had already been made. My mind raced back to everything that had happened. The Ouija board, the dark web forum, the messages. It all started when Mike clicked that button, when he opened the door for them. We hadn't chosen this, but someone had. Someone had invited them in. I turned to Mike, my voice cold, calculated. You brought them here." His eyes widened in shock, his face going pale. "What? No, I didn't." "You're the one who clicked the link," I continued, my words coming out harder than I expected. "You're the one who opened the forum. You ignored the warnings. You let them in." The weight of what I was saying began to sink in. Mike's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The rest of us were silent, watching him, as the realization hit. Mike had been the one to break the rules. He had been the one to make the first move. "They want a life," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it should be yours." Sarah gasped beside me, her hand flying to her mouth. Chris shifted uncomfortably in the back seat, his eyes darting between us. No one wanted to say it out loud, but I had to. If it was the only way to end this nightmare, to stop the Watchers from following us, then maybe it had to be him. Mike shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "Number, no, no, no. You can't ask me to do that. We're all in this together. It's not just me." But even as he said it, I could see the guilt in his eyes. He knew, deep down, he knew he had made the choice the moment he clicked that button. And now he would have to live with the consequences, or die with them. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking, "but we can't run forever." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind whistling through the shattered windshield, the road stretching out endlessly before us. Mike's breath hitched, his hands shaking as he looked from me to the others, his eyes pleading. "Please," he begged, tears welling up in his eyes. "There's got to be another way." But there wasn't. We all knew it. Then, from the back seat, Chris spoke. "It has to end." Sarah turned away, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't bear to look at him. I couldn't blame her. Mike's sobs filled the car as he stared at the glowing figures in the rearview mirror, his fate sealed. Slowly, he reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." With one final glance at us, he opened the door and stepped out into the night. As soon as his feet hit the ground, the figures stopped, their glowing eyes fixed on Mike, their twisted grins widening as they surrounded him. He didn't run, he didn't scream. He just stood there, shaking, waiting for whatever was about to come. The last thing I saw before I hit the gas was Mike's face, pale, tear-streaked, and full of regret. Then we drove away. We didn't talk much after that. No one knew what to say. The figures had vanished the moment Mike stepped out, disappearing into the darkness like they had never been there. But the silence they left behind was almost worse. We never went back to that house, never touched another Ouija board. Sarah and I stayed together for a while, but things were never the same. How could they be after what we'd been through? After what we'd done? Every now and then, I wonder if it really ended that night, if the Watchers truly took what they wanted, or if they're still out there somewhere, waiting for someone else to break the rules, waiting for someone to look when they shouldn't, waiting for someone to open the door, because once you see them, they never really go away. It started out as one of those nights where nothing was supposed to happen. You know the type. Just hanging out with a few friends, killing time, talking about random stuff. It was me, Hannah, and Liam. We'd been close since high school, and now that we were all back in town for the summer, we'd been doing a lot of this. Late night hangouts at my place, watching movies, playing games, reminiscing about old times. That night, though, it was different. The power had gone out around 9 p.m, typical for this town whenever there was a storm brewing. I didn't think much of it. It wasn't like we had any big plans. But Liam, always the one looking for excitement in the smallest of things, had this idea. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a Ouija board. I remember rolling my eyes. "You've got to be kidding, man. Isn't that thing like 20 years old?" Liam just grinned. "Exactly. That's what makes it cool. He placed it on the coffee table in front of us, like he was revealing some ancient artifact. Hannah shot me a look. I don't know about this, she said. She was always the most grounded out of the three of us, the one who wasn't easily spooked. But tonight, there was a nervous edge in her voice. You really want to mess around with that? Liam was already lighting a couple of candles he found in the kitchen drawer. Come on, it's just a game. Let's see if we can freak ourselves out a little. I shrugged, not wanting to be the one to kill the mood. Besides, it was dark, the storm was rolling in, and the flickering candlelight gave the room a creepy enough vibe to make it feel like we were already in some kind of horror movie. What could it hurt? We gathered around the board, all of us sitting cross-legged on the floor. Liam placed his hands on the planchette, giving me a challenging look. Are you guys ready? Hannah sighed, but put her fingers on the planchette too. I followed. The air in the room felt heavier now, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. But I tried to push that thought away. It's just a board game, I reminded myself. Liam, in his usual dramatic fashion, closed his eyes and asked, Is there anyone here with us? Nothing. Not surprising. The board sat there, as lifeless as it had been a few seconds ago. I almost laughed at how seriously Liam was taking it, but then the planchette twitched. Did you feel that? Hannah whispered, her eyes wide. I felt it too, a slight shift, like the board had come to life. My heart started racing, but I didn't move my hands. None of us did. The planchette moved again, slowly, dragging itself across the board, circling around the letters. Liam's grin faded. He wasn't messing with us. None of us were. The planchette paused for a moment, then moved deliberately to YES. We all sat there, stunned into silence. The air in the room felt colder, heavier. Hannah cleared her throat. Who are you? The planchette didn't move right away, but when it did, it moved faster than before. It spelled out LETITIN. I pulled my hands away instinctively. Nope, no way, we're done. But Liam, of course, wasn't ready to stop. Let what in? He asked, his fingers still on the planchette. It didn't take long for it to move again. LETITIN, it repeated. Hannah backed away from the table, shaking her head. I don't like this, guys. This doesn't feel right. I was about to agree with her when we heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails on wood, coming from somewhere inside the walls. We all froze, listening. It was quiet at first, just a subtle scraping sound. But then it grew louder, more persistent, like something was trying to get out. Do you hear that? Liam asked, his voice shaky for the first time. The noise was unmistakable now, like something was moving behind the walls. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't the wind, and it sure as hell wasn't the storm. It was coming from inside the house. Hannah stood up, backing away from the table. We need to stop this, right now. But Liam wasn't ready to give up. He looked at the board, eyes wide, his fingers still resting on the planchette. What did we let in? Before I could tell him to stop, the lights flickered back on. Just like that, the room felt normal again. The storm outside, nothing more than a soft rumble in the distance. The scratching stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that hung in the air. We stared at the board, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was nothing. No movement. No sounds. Just the quiet hum of the house returning to normal. Liam laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. Guess the power's back. Must have been the wind messing with the walls. But I wasn't convinced. Neither was Hannah. We both felt it. That sense that something was still wrong, lingering just beneath the surface. We'd asked the board a question, and it had answered. Let it in. Whatever it wasn't a joke. We put the board away and tried to move on with the night, but the feeling didn't go away. Every now and then, I'd catch Hannah glancing at the walls, her brow furrowed like she was still listening for that sound. Liam left around midnight, making some dumb joke about how we should have asked for lottery numbers instead of ghosts. Hannah stayed for a while longer, but she was quiet, distracted. She didn't say it out loud, but I could tell she felt it too, that whatever we'd started, it wasn't over. When I finally crawled into bed that night, the house felt different. The wind outside had died down, but every creak, every shift of the house settling, sent a chill down my spine. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, that the Ouija board hadn't really done anything. But deep down, I knew better. Something had changed. And as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it again. The scratching. Faint at first, but growing louder. Something was behind the walls. The scratching had kept me up most of the night. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe mice in the walls. Anything but the truth that had been clawing at the back of my mind ever since we touched that Ouija board. But by the time I finally managed to get some sleep, the sun was already creeping through the blinds, casting a weak light over my room. When I woke up, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. That uneasy silence had settled back in, like the walls were listening. I tried to shake off the feeling, heading to the kitchen to make some coffee, but my mind was buzzing with what had happened the night before. What did we let in? I almost jumped when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Hannah. "Hey, did you hear anything weird last night?" I stared at the message for a second, my heart racing again. She'd heard it too. "Yeah, the scratching," I replied. "Did it happen at your place?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Yeah, I thought it was just me. It was so loud, Jake. I swear it was coming from inside the walls." Great. So it wasn't just my imagination. Whatever we had heard, it wasn't confined to my house. Liam's name popped into my mind. I hadn't heard from him since last night, and knowing him, he'd probably just brush this whole thing off, calling us paranoid. But I texted him anyway. "Yo, you hear anything strange last night, like scratching or something?" I expected him to take his time responding, but his reply came within seconds. "Scratching? Bro, I haven't heard anything. You guys freaking out over nothing, lol." Classic Liam. Always the skeptic, always downplaying everything. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to convince myself that I was just letting my mind get the better of me. But I knew what I'd heard. And now that Hannah had confirmed it too, I couldn't just let it go. I tried to go about my day, but the weird feeling in my house stuck with me. I avoided the living room, especially the spot where we'd set up the Ouija board. Every time I passed by, I swore I could feel a presence, like something was watching from the corners, waiting for me to drop my guard. Around noon, I heard it again, the scratching. It was subtle at first, just a faint scraping noise, but then it grew louder, like something was burrowing through the walls, desperate to get out. I pressed my ear to the wall, listening intently, my heart thudding in my chest. There it was, scratching, scraping like nails dragging across wood. I backed away, my skin crawling. I wasn't imagining it. Something was in the walls. I grabbed my phone and called Hannah. She picked up on the first ring. "Are you hearing it again?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "Yeah," I said, pacing the room. "It's louder now. It's not just in my head, right?" "It's real. It's happening here too. I swear, it sounds like it's getting closer." There was a pause, and then she added, "Do you think it's because of what we asked the Ouija board?" That question hung in the air like a weight I didn't want to acknowledge. Part of me knew the answer. Let it in. Whatever we had talked to, whatever had answered us, it was in here now, and it wasn't leaving. I didn't want to freak her out, but I couldn't lie either. I think we opened something." "Opened what, Jake?" Her voice was rising, panic creeping in. "What did we let in?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we need to talk to Liam." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Hannah said, "What if he doesn't believe us?" He will, I said, even though I wasn't so sure. He has to. We decided to meet at Liam's place later that afternoon. Maybe if we all sat down and talked about it, we could figure out what to do. Maybe this whole thing would start to make sense. I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The moment I stepped outside, I felt a weight lift from my chest, like the house itself had been suffocating me. The fresh air helped, but there was still a sense of dread hanging over me. When I arrived at Liam's place, he was sitting on his front porch, scrolling through his phone like nothing was wrong. Typical. "Hey," he called out, grinning. "You guys still freaked out about last night?" I shot him a look. "You haven't heard the scratching?" He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Nope. Slept like a baby. You guys are just spooking yourselves." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the fear in Hannah's eyes as she walked up behind me told me we weren't just imagining things. "We need to figure this out, Liam," she said, crossing her arms tightly. "Something's wrong. It's not just the board. There's something in our houses. Something behind the walls." Liam rolled his eyes, but I could see a flicker of doubt in his expression. "All right, fine," he said, standing up. "Let's check out your place, Jake. Prove you're not losing it." We drove back to my house in tense silence. Liam was still joking around, but I could tell he was trying to push down his unease. Hannah didn't say much, but her hand was gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. When we got inside, the house felt colder than it should have. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like the walls themselves were watching us. I led them to the living room, pointing at the spot where the board had been. Liam stood there, arms crossed, waiting for something to happen. "So, where's this scratching?" Almost on cue, the sound returned, faint at first, but growing louder by the second. The scratching, the scraping. It was like something was crawling through the walls, moving just behind the surface. Liam's grin faded. He heard it too. "Okay, that's weird," he muttered, his eyes darting around the room. "Maybe you've got rats or something." But I knew better. This wasn't the sound of animals. It was too deliberate, too intentional. It wasn't just random scratching. It was like whatever was behind the walls was trying to communicate. Hannah's face went pale as the sound intensified, now coming from all around us. "This isn't rats, Liam." And then, for the first time, Liam looked scared. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by an even more unsettling sound, a soft, whispering voice. It was faint, almost like a breeze moving through the walls, but it was unmistakable. We all froze, listening. It was saying something we couldn't understand. Liam backed away from the wall, his face drained of colour. "What the hell is that?" Before I could respond, there was a loud thud, like something had slammed against the wall from the other side. We jumped, our nerves on edge, as the sound echoed through the house. And then we heard it again, clearer this time. The whispering, growing louder, more insistent. Let it in. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for what was going to happen next. The whispering continued, low and guttural, like a language that shouldn't exist, pressing in from every direction. It was almost as if the walls themselves were speaking, urging us to listen, to give in. Liam took a step back, his usual bravado completely gone. Okay, this isn't funny anymore," he stammered, his voice shaking. Hannah, standing by the doorway, had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. We shouldn't have touched that board. We shouldn't have asked those questions. I didn't say anything because she was right. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out, to leave the house and never come back, but something kept me frozen in place. That whispering, that strange voice. It was calling to me, drawing me closer to the wall. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was something else entirely. But I found myself walking toward the wall where the scratching and whispers seemed loudest. My fingers brushed against the cold surface, and for just a second, it felt like the wall was breathing. like something was alive inside it. "Jake, what the hell are you doing?" Liam whispered, his voice sharp with panic. "Get away from there." But I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, filling my mind with thoughts that weren't my own. "Let it in." The phrase repeated over and over, echoing in my skull. Then, suddenly, the wall under my hand shifted. The surface bulged outward, like something was trying to push its way through. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest as the wall pulsed again, the whispers turning into guttural growls. "Did you see that?" I gasped, pointing at the wall. "It moved. Something's in there." Liam's face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. This can't be real. It has to be some kind of trick." But we all knew it wasn't a trick. Whatever was behind those walls, it wasn't something we could explain. It wasn't something that belonged here. Hannah grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "We need to leave, now." We ran out of the house, not stopping until we were standing in the middle of the driveway, gasping for air. The storm clouds that had been gathering all day were now overhead, casting the entire neighborhood in an eerie grey light. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. Liam paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "What the hell was that? What did we let in?" "I don't know," I said, still trying to catch my breath. "But whatever it is, it's in the walls. It's not leaving." Hannah was shaking, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to ward off the cold creeping in from more than just the weather. "We need to destroy the board," she said suddenly. "That's where it started. If we get rid of it, maybe it'll stop." Liam and I exchanged a glance. I wasn't sure if destroying the board would solve anything, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. We'd messed with something we didn't understand, and now it was crawling through the walls of my house, whispering things no one should hear. "Let's do it," I said finally. We headed back inside, moving cautiously, as if expecting something to jump out at us from the shadows. The house felt even colder than before, the air thick with a sense of dread that seemed to grow with each step. The living room was exactly how we'd left it. The Ouija board still lying on the coffee table like some cursed relic. Liam grabbed it, his hands trembling as he lifted it into the air. "We'll burn it," he said. "That should do it, right?" Hannah nodded, though she didn't seem convinced. "It has to." But as soon as Liam took a step toward the door, the scratching started again. Louder this time, more frantic. We froze, listening as the sound intensified, like claws raking against the walls, tearing at the wood. It was coming from all around us now, like the entire house was alive with the sound of something trapped inside, desperate to break free. The whispers returned, growing louder with each second, filling the room with a chorus of low, incomprehensible voices. The words twisted and garbled, but one phrase kept repeating over and over, clear and unmistakable. "Let it in. Let it in." Liam's eyes darted around the room, panic taking over. "We need to get out of here. Screw the board. Let's just go." But before we could move, the walls groaned, and then a low, guttural growl reverberated through the house. It was like something huge was moving through the walls, pushing against the very structure, warping the house around it. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and the air felt thick with pressure, like we were being crushed from all sides. Then, from the far corner of the room, the wall bulged again, a massive shape pressing outward, bending the wood like it was made of nothing. I felt my stomach drop. Whatever was in there wasn't just some spirit or ghost. It was something much worse. "Run!" Hannah screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted for the front door, throwing it open and racing outside into the storm. The wind whipped around us, and the sky overhead was dark with swirling clouds. But I didn't care. We had to get away from that house, from whatever was trying to get out. But as we reached the edge of the yard, I stopped. The scratching, the whispers, they weren't just coming from the house anymore. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw it, small bulges in the ground, rippling toward us from the direction of the house, like something was moving through the earth itself. "Oh my God," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. "It's spreading." Liam stared at the moving ground in horror. "How do we stop it?" I didn't know. None of us did. Whatever we'd unleashed, whatever we had let in, it wasn't confined to the house anymore. It was moving, growing, following us wherever we went. The storm overhead rumbled, and I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on us, thick with tension, like something was waiting to strike. And then, just for a moment, the wind died down, and everything went eerily quiet. The whispers returned, clearer than before, surrounding us from every direction. Let it in. The whispers were all around us, echoing through the storm, carried on the wind like a chant. Let it in, over and over again, relentless. It didn't matter that we had left the house. Whatever we had unleashed was following us, moving through the ground, through the air, like it was tethered to us, like it was us. "We have to do something," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "We have to stop it." But how? I didn't know what this thing was, let alone how to stop it. All I knew was that it wanted something we had invited in without realizing it. My mind was spinning, trying to find a way out, but every idea felt like it would only make things worse. "We need to burn the board," Liam said, his voice steady for the first time since this whole nightmare had started. He still had the Ouija board clutched tightly under his arm, like it was the only thing keeping us connected to whatever was happening. "That's the source. If we destroy it, maybe it'll stop." "Maybe," I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. The whispers weren't just coming from the board anymore. They were everywhere. We ran toward the woods behind my house, hoping the rain would let up enough for us to start a fire. The storm was raging now, the wind whipping through the trees, but there was a small clearing up ahead, an old fire pit we used to hang out at during summer nights. It seemed like the best place to try. As we reached the clearing, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The ground beneath us felt alive, like something was moving just below the surface, waiting to break through. "Quick, get the fire started," I said, my voice barely holding steady. Liam fumbled with the lighter in his pocket, his hands shaking as he tried to spark a flame. The wind kept blowing it out, and the rain wasn't helping. Hannah was pacing, glancing around nervously, her eyes darting to the trees as if she expected something to emerge from the darkness at any moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lighter caught, and a small flame flickered to life. We quickly piled some dry leaves and sticks into the pit, shielding the fire from the wind with our bodies. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Liam held up the Ouija board, his face pale but determined. "Here goes nothing." He tossed the board into the flames, and for a moment we just stood there, watching, as the fire slowly licked at the edges of the wood. The whispers grew louder, filling the air around us, the same phrase repeating in that guttural, unnatural tone, "Let it in." The flames spread quickly, engulfing the board in seconds. Smoke billowed up into the night, and for a brief moment, I thought it was working. The whispers seemed to fade, the scratching stopped, and the air around us felt lighter, like the weight was finally lifting. But then the fire sputtered, and the smoke turned black, thick and oily, like tar. The flames twisted unnaturally, spiraling upward in a way that defied logic. And the whispers, they didn't stop. They grew louder, more intense. Something was wrong. Hannah screamed, backing away from the fire as the smoke thickened, swirling around us like a living thing. The flames flared up, and in the flickering light I saw it. Something dark, something massive, moving through the smoke. Its form was shifting, unsteady, like it was made of shadows and smoke itself. "Get back!" I shouted, pulling Liam away from the fire. But it was too late. The thing in the smoke surged forward, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. It was everywhere at once, surrounding us, pressing in from all sides. The whispers were deafening now, filling my head with that same relentless command. Let it in. Let it in. Liam stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. It's not stopping. It's making it worse. The fire was burning too hot now, flames twisting and curling in ways that didn't make sense. The air was thick with the stench of burning wood and something else, something foul like rotting flesh. And the shadows. They weren't just in the smoke anymore. They were everywhere, seeping through the ground, creeping up the trees, slithering through the air like living darkness. Hannah was sobbing, her hands clamped over her ears as if she could block out the whispers, but I could still hear them. They were inside my head, crawling through my thoughts, twisting everything into knots. "We have to run," I said, grabbing both Liam and Hannah by the arms. "We can't stay here." "But where do we go?" Liam shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm and the whispers. "I don't know. Just move." We ran. We didn't have a plan, didn't have any direction, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting away from the fire, from the thing in the smoke, from the whispers that were tearing us apart. The trees blurred past us as we sprinted through the woods, the wind howling in our ears. The ground beneath us felt uneven, like it was shifting, moving under our feet. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay, and every shadow seemed to writhe and twist, watching us as we ran. But no matter how far we went, no matter how fast we moved, the whispers followed us. Let it in. The woods opened up into a clearing, and we stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they were quieter now, like whatever was chasing us had paused, waiting for the right moment to strike. Hannah collapsed onto the ground, tears streaming down her face. "It's not going to stop. It's not going to stop until we're all gone." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't. I could feel it too. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to stop. It was inside us now, inside our minds, our bodies, our very souls. We had let it in, and now there was no getting rid of it. Liam sat down next to her, his face blank, his eyes hollow. What do we do? I didn't have an answer. We'd burned the board, but that had only made it worse. Whatever we had unleashed, whatever we had let in, it wasn't tied to the board anymore. It was part of the world now, part of us. I stood up, looking around the clearing, my mind racing. There had to be something, some way to fight it. But all I could hear was the wind, the rain, and that constant, relentless whisper. Let it in. "We need to face it," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Whatever it is, we need to confront it. It's not going to stop until we do." Hannah looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. "How do we face something like that? It's not even real." "It's real," I said, my voice steadying. "It's real, and it's here." The trees around us rustled, and for a moment the storm seemed to pause, the wind dying down, the rain slowing to a soft patter. And then, from the darkness, something moved. It was slow at first, just a faint rustling sound, like something sliding through the underbrush. But then it grew louder, closer, until we could see it. Something dark and massive, shifting through the shadows, its form indistinct, like it was made of smoke and shadows. The whispers grew louder again, filling the clearing, wrapping around us like a shroud. Let it in. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to do, didn't know how to stop it, but I couldn't run anymore. We couldn't run. "We're here," I said softly, my voice barely audible over the whispers. "We're here." And then the thing in the shadows stopped. It was watching us, waiting. The thing in the shadows loomed at the edge of the clearing, still and silent, but the air around it pulsed with a darkness that seemed to crawl toward us. Its form was unclear, shifting like smoke caught in a gust of wind, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. My skin prickled with the sensation, my heartbeat loud in my ears. The whispers had stopped, For the first time since this nightmare began, everything was quiet. I could hear Liam and Hannah behind me, breathing hard, their fear tangible. No one spoke. No one moved. We were standing on the edge of something far beyond our understanding, and all we could do was wait. The thing didn't move closer. It just stood there, waiting, like it was waiting for us to do something, like it wanted us to make the first move. Let it in. The words echoed in my mind, though the whispering had stopped. I could feel them, pressing in on me, trying to force me to understand. Whatever this thing was, whatever we had let in, it wasn't something we could fight. It wasn't something we could burn or destroy. It was already a part of us. We have to face it, I repeated, though I didn't know what that meant anymore. My voice felt distant, like it was coming from someone else. My mind was numb, but deep down, I knew there was no other option. Hannah's voice trembled as she spoke. Face it? How? Look at it, Jake. What even is that? I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I knew was that running hadn't worked. Burning the board hadn't worked. Whatever this thing wanted, we had already given it permission to enter, and now it was waiting for us to accept that. I think, I said, the words forming slowly, I think we have to let it in. Liam's head snapped toward me, his face twisted in disbelief. Are you out of your mind? We've been running from this thing, and now you want to let it in. What other choice do we have? I said, keeping my eyes on the dark figure. It's already here. It's in the walls. It's in the ground. We can't fight it. But maybe if we let it in, it'll stop. There was a long silence. I could feel the weight of my own words, the gravity of what I was suggesting. It sounded insane. But everything about this night had been insane, and logic had no place in whatever this was. We let it in, I repeated, more to myself than to anyone else. And maybe it'll leave. Hannah stared at me, tears brimming in her eyes. But what if it doesn't leave? What if it takes us? I don't know, I said softly. But I can't keep running. Liam looked at me like I'd completely lost it, but he wasn't arguing anymore. The fear in his eyes said it all. He was out of ideas. We all were. I took a step forward, my legs shaking, but I kept moving. The thing in the shadows didn't react. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones as I approached it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken around me, like I was walking through something dense and alive. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, pressing against me from all sides. When I was just a few feet away, I stopped. My mind was screaming at me to turn back, to run, but I forced myself to stay still. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the fear, trying to focus on the only thing that mattered now. Take it, I whispered. Whatever you want, take it. For a moment, nothing happened. The air around me was still, the night silent. And then, slowly, I felt it. A coldness creeping over me, starting at my fingertips and spreading through my body like ice. It was like the very air was seeping into my skin, filling me with something foreign, something dark. The sensation was both terrifying and strangely calm. I could feel it moving through me, filling every part of me, but it didn't hurt. It wasn't violent. It was acceptance. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't external. They were inside me, soft and distant, like the faintest echo of something long forgotten. You let it in. I opened my eyes, and the figure was gone. The clearing was empty, the night still and quiet once more. The storm had passed. The trees stood motionless, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The only sound was the faint crackle of the dying fire behind us. I turned back to Hannah and Liam. They were staring at me, their faces pale, but the fear was fading. It was like the tension that had been suffocating us all night had lifted. It's over, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Liam shook his head, still processing what had just happened. What did you do? I don't know, I admitted. But it's gone. Hannah stepped forward, her eyes searching mine. Are you okay? I nodded, though I wasn't sure. Something had changed. I could feel it deep inside me, like a weight that had settled into my chest. But the whispers were gone. The scratching was gone. Whatever we had let in, it had taken what it wanted. We stood there for a long time, just listening to the quiet night. The fear that had gripped us for hours was slowly fading, replaced by a strange sense of peace. It was over. The thing in the walls, the shadows, it was gone. But even as I tried to believe that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that something had stayed behind, buried deep within us, within me. We left the clearing in silence, walking back through the woods with the weight of the night still heavy on our shoulders. The house loomed ahead, dark and quiet, but it didn't feel the same. It felt empty. As we stepped through the door, I paused, listening for any sign of the whispers, any hint of the scratching. But there was nothing, just silence. Liam and Hannah looked at me, their eyes still filled with uncertainty. But I forced a smile, trying to push down the gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right. It's over, I said again, more for myself than for them. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't over. I had let it in. It all started as a joke. I don't know why we thought it was a good idea. Maybe it was boredom, maybe the beers were hitting harder than we expected. Either way, that's how it began. A bunch of friends sitting around a dusty old Ouija board in my friend Matt's basement, thinking we were going to get a cheap thrill by messing with the unknown. We'd all heard stories, of course. You know the type. Friends of friends who claimed the Ouija board worked, that they'd talk to someone from the other side, only to have creepy stuff start happening afterward. But it was always the same formula. A few knocks, a flickering light, some chills down the spine, and then they'd throw the board away and laugh it off a few days later. That night was different. There were 5 of us. Matt, his girlfriend Sophie, her cousin Mike, my friend Jake, and me. Matt had found the Ouija board in his attic when he was moving some old boxes around, and it looked ancient, like something you'd see in a horror movie. The edges were worn, the letters faded, and the planchette had a weird, almost greasy feel to it. But it was still usable. Of course, we didn't take it seriously. Not at first, anyway. "All right, who do we want to talk to?" Matt asked, leaning over the board with a smirk. "Someone interesting," Sophie said. "No random ghosts." "How about a celebrity?" Jake suggested, clearly not into the whole thing, but willing to go along. "Like Elvis or something." I laughed. Yeah, because that's original. But then Mike, who had been quiet up until this point, said something that changed the entire mood of the room. "Why don't we ask about the government? Like, see if we can learn something they don't want us to know." The room went silent for a second. Matt raised an eyebrow, and Sophie shifted uncomfortably. "Ask what exactly?" I said, trying to play it cool but feeling a little knot of unease form in my stomach. "You think we're going to get top secret intel from a spirit?" "I don't know," Mike shrugged. "Why not? Just something fun. See if there's anything they've covered up." Jake grinned. "All right, sure. Let's ask the ghosts about Area 51. We all laughed nervously, but I could feel the energy in the room shift. What had started as a harmless game was starting to feel off. Still, we went along with it. Matt placed his hands on the planchette, and the rest of us followed. "If there's anyone here," Matt said, putting on a mock-serious tone, "tell us something the government doesn't want us to know." Nothing happened at first. The planchette stayed completely still, just like it always did in these situations. I could hear Sophie snicker under her breath, and I was about to make a joke about how we must not be that interesting to the dead when the planchette suddenly jerked. At first, it was a small movement, barely a nudge, but enough to make everyone freeze. "Who moved it?" Sophie asked, her voice sharp, but no one answered. Everyone looked around, equally confused. Then it moved again. Slowly, deliberately, it slid across the board, stopping over the letter A. My heart picked up a bit. The air in the basement felt thicker all of a sudden, but I tried to keep it cool. "Someone's messing with us," I said, glancing at Matt, expecting to see him grinning or trying to suppress a laugh. But he wasn't. He looked just as surprised as the rest of us. The planchette moved again, this time faster. R-E-A. My breath hitched in my throat as the letters kept coming. A-R-E-A. "Wait," Jake said, his eyes wide. "Is it spelling out Area 51? We all stared at the board, our fingers still resting on the planchette, but none of us were pushing it. That was clear. It moved again, faster this time. 5. First I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine, but I wasn't ready to freak out. It could still be one of us, right? Just playing around. That's what I kept telling myself. But then it started spelling out something else. The planchette moved quickly, almost frantically, sliding over the letters. H-E-L-P. We all froze. The room felt dead quiet, and the light from the old basement lamp seemed dimmer, casting strange shadows on the walls. No one spoke. We just watched as the planchette continued moving. T-R-A-P. "What the hell?" Sophie whispered, pulling her hands back from the board. "Who's doing this?" "I'm not," Matt said, sounding genuinely freaked out. "I swear, I'm not." We all sat there in stunned silence, watching as the planchette stopped dead in the center of the board. The message was clear, and none of us knew what to do with it. "Help. Trap," Jake muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "This is messed up." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the tension. "All right, so it's creepy, but that doesn't mean it's real. We probably just spooked ourselves." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching us. The basement felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching out toward us. We were all about to call it quits when my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was just a random notification, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. There was a message. No name, no number. Just one word, in bold letters. "Run." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. This had to be a coincidence, right? It had to be. But when I showed the message to the others, their faces drained of color. No one knew what to say. "Who sent that?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I muttered, my hand shaking as I held the phone. "There's no number, no name." We sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. No one moved, no one spoke. The basement, once filled with nervous laughter and half-hearted jokes, now felt like a tomb. Suddenly the lights flickered, casting strange, erratic shadows across the walls. And then we heard it, a faint tapping coming from the far corner of the room. It was slow, rhythmic, like someone lightly tapping their fingers against the concrete wall. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. We all just stared at the corner, where the shadows seemed to shift and move on their own. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, like it was coming closer. I grabbed my phone again, my hands trembling. Another message appeared on the screen, making my heart skip a beat. "You shouldn't have asked." And that's when I realized we'd gone too far. Whatever we had reached out to, whatever we had tried to uncover, was real, and now it knew where we were. The tapping echoed through the room, growing louder, more deliberate. I couldn't see anything in the corner where the noise came from, but I knew, we all knew, something was there, watching us. The basement felt colder, the air heavier, like it was pressing down on us. No one spoke. Sophie was staring at her hands, refusing to look at the shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally against the walls. Mike was standing now, backing away from the Ouija board like it was a ticking bomb. Matt's usual carefree grin was gone, replaced by a look of pure terror. I glanced down at my phone, hoping it was just a bad dream. But the message was still there. You shouldn't have asked. My mind was racing, trying to find some explanation. Someone had to be messing with us, right? But how could they? No one outside this room even knew we were playing with the Ouija board. The number wasn't blocked. It was completely non-existent. Jake stood up, breaking the silence. "All right, this is too much," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm done. Whatever this is, we're stopping it now." Before anyone could argue, he reached down to grab the board, intending to throw it aside. But as soon as his fingers touched the planchette, the lights went out. The room was plunged into total darkness. We were submerged in an instant, oppressive blackness, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of your breathing, your heartbeat, every small noise. The tapping stopped, replaced by a deep, unnerving silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The darkness felt alive, like something was crawling through it, watching us from the shadows. I reached for my phone, desperate for any kind of light. The glow from the screen flickered to life, casting a pale, ghostly hue over the room. I held it up, scanning the basement. Everyone was frozen in place, their faces pale, eyes wide. And then my phone buzzed again. I almost didn't want to look, but my hands moved on their own. Another message had appeared. "We warned you. Now it's too late." I showed the screen to the others, my heart pounding in my chest. Matt's face went white as he read the words. "Who is doing this?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "How are they doing this?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. Suddenly, from the far corner of the room, a new sound emerged. It wasn't the soft tapping anymore. It was something else, something worse, a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My pulse quickened as I realized it was getting closer. Mike backed up until he was against the wall, his eyes darting around the room. "I'm out," he muttered. "I'm done. We have to leave." But no one moved. It was like we were paralyzed, unable to process what was happening. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, and the temperature in the room dropped even more. My breath was coming out in short, visible puffs. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow. It moved differently from the rest, slinking along the walls, twisting unnaturally. It wasn't shaped like a person. It was longer, too tall, its limbs bending at strange angles as it crept forward. I could barely make out its form in the dim glow of my phone, but it was there, inching toward us. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No one answered, but I knew they saw it too. Sophie let out a strangled gasp, her hand gripping Matt's arm tightly. The shadow paused like it knew we were watching it, like it was waiting for us to make a move. My phone buzzed again, and I nearly dropped it from the shock. With shaking hands, I looked at the screen. "It's coming." That was it. No explanation, no follow-up. Just those two words. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely working. "Now!" We all moved at once, a rush of panicked energy filling the room. Jake led the way toward the stairs, but just as we reached the first step, the dragging sound stopped. I glanced over my shoulder, my pulse racing, and saw the shadow, still there, still watching. But now it was closer, much closer. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. There was something in the darkness, something solid, something real. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind us. My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely hear anything else. We ran into the living room, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "I told you we shouldn't have messed with this!" Sophie shouted, her voice shaking with fear. "I told you!" Matt was pacing, his hands running through his hair. What was that? What the hell was that thing? No one had an answer. We all sat there, too scared to go back into the basement, too freaked out to even speak. But as I sat there, trying to catch my breath, my phone buzzed one more time. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to see what message had come through this time, but I had to. I glanced down and felt my stomach drop. It was a picture, a dark, grainy photo taken from inside the basement, showing us just moments before we had run out. The shadow, whatever it was looming behind us, barely visible in the darkness. But it was there, clear as day. Underneath the photo was a single word. Soon. I dropped the phone, backing away like it had burned me. We need to leave, I whispered, barely able to get the words out. We need to leave this house. Jake was already grabbing his keys. We'll go to my place. We'll figure this out later. We didn't even bother packing up. We just ran out of the house, piling into Jake's car and speeding off into the night. The entire ride, my phone stayed silent. No more messages, no more warnings. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had contacted wasn't done with us. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it found us again. We sped down the empty streets in Jake's car, the quiet hum of the engine doing nothing to soothe the growing tension. No one spoke. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on us, like the air itself had thickened. Every bump in the road felt like a jolt, and every shadow outside the car seemed to stretch too far, lingering too long in the corner of my vision. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting another message to appear, but the screen remained dark and lifeless. The last text I had gotten, the one with the picture, was still burned into my mind. That shadow, looming behind us in the basement, had felt so real, so close. Whatever we had stirred up wasn't just a game anymore. As we pulled into the driveway of Jake's house, the tension in the car grew even thicker. His place wasn't anything special, just a small one-story house on the edge of town. But at that moment, it felt like a sanctuary, like the one place we might be safe. Jake cut the engine, and we all sat there for a second, staring at the house in silence. "I don't think it'll follow us here," Jake said, his voice shaky, but trying to sound convincing. "We're far enough away, right?" No one answered. We just wanted to believe him. Needed to. We got out of the car and headed inside, sticking close together as if being apart for even a second might make us vulnerable. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every little sound, every creak, every sigh of the wind, feel amplified. Jake turned on the lights, flooding the room with an artificial brightness that somehow made the shadows feel even darker. "Okay," Matt said, pacing around the living room. "What the hell is going on? That thing, whatever it was, wasn't just some ghost, it was real. And how the hell did it send us those messages?" Mike chimed in, clearly rattled. No one outside the house knew we were messing with the Ouija board. "I don't know," Sophie said quietly, sitting on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself. "But I think it wanted us to ask. It wanted us to reach out to it." Jake sat down beside her, rubbing his face with both hands. "This is insane. We never should have asked that question." I stayed silent, staring down at my phone. I couldn't stop thinking about that last picture, the shadow looming behind us. We had asked about government secrets, thinking it would be a joke, something fun to mess around with. But what if this was connected to something bigger? What if we had tapped into something we weren't supposed to know? Suddenly, my phone buzzed. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the others, but no one seemed to have noticed. With shaking hands, I unlocked the screen. Another message. "You can't hide." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My hands were trembling so badly that I almost dropped the phone. The others noticed my reaction, and Sophie leaned forward, her face pale. "What is it? Another message?" she asked. I nodded, showing them the screen. You can't hide, Jake read aloud, his voice thick with dread. What does that mean? Are they following us? They? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean, they? I don't know, Jake muttered. It just feels like there's more than one, like something or someone is watching us. The lights in the house flickered for just a moment, like a surge in the power, but it was enough to make my heart race. We all stared at each other, and I could see the same fear reflected in everyone's eyes. I didn't want to admit it, but Jake was right. This felt bigger than just one entity. It felt like something far-reaching, something vast, was watching. And then the knocking started again. Not like before, not soft, subtle taps. This was harder, more deliberate. It was coming from the front door. Everyone froze, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. Mike stood up, his face pale. Who could that be? We all knew it wasn't anyone we wanted to see. Another knock. Louder this time. The door rattled in its frame like whatever was outside was trying to get in. I glanced at Jake, who was gripping the armrest of the couch, his knuckles white. No one moved. Then, as quickly as it started, the knocking stopped. Silence. I strained to hear anything, footsteps, breathing, something. But there was nothing. Just the suffocating quiet that seemed to fill every inch of the house. And then my phone buzzed again. I almost didn't want to look, but I had to. The message was brief. We're here. Sophie let out a small, choked gasp, her eyes wide with fear. What do we do? We can't stay here. Matt was already pacing again, his hands running through his hair. We need to leave. Maybe they're tracking us through our phones or something. We need to get off the grid. Off the grid? Mike repeated. You sound insane. I'm serious, Matt snapped, panic creeping into his voice. We need to get somewhere they can't find us. Jake stood up, shaking his head. No, we stay here. We lock the doors, stay together, and wait until morning. But we didn't make it that far. The lights flickered again, this time more violently. The room plunged into darkness, the air around us suddenly cold. I could hear Sophie's shaky breath beside me, the sound of Matt muttering under his breath as the shadows seemed to creep closer. A faint, buzzing sound filled the air, like static, low and electric. I fumbled for my phone, using the screen's dim light to cut through the darkness. Another message appeared. Look outside. I felt my stomach twist into knots. My hand was shaking as I held up the phone for the others to see. No way, Jake muttered. I'm not looking. The house creaked. The floorboards groaned, and I could hear something moving outside. Slowly, cautiously, I turned toward the front window, my heart racing in my chest. There, just beyond the glass, was a figure, dark, indistinct, standing in the driveway. It didn't move. It didn't try to get closer. It just stood there, watching. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. There's someone out there. The others turned to look, their eyes wide with fear. The figure remained still, its shadow stretching across the driveway under the faint light of the street lamp. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could feel its gaze locked on us. The buzzing grew louder, filling the room with a low hum. My phone buzzed again. I glanced down. You asked for the truth. Now you have to live with it. The air in the house grew colder. I could feel it pressing down on us, like the walls were closing in. And in that moment, I realized the horrible truth. Whatever we had asked about, the government's secrets, the conspiracy, it wasn't just information. It was something bigger, something darker. We had opened a door, and now they were here, and they weren't going to let us go. We stood there, staring at the figure outside the window, our breath shallow, hearts pounding. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, like it was waiting for something. The air inside the house felt suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in, pressing us together. My phone buzzed again, but this time I didn't look. I didn't need to. I knew whatever message was waiting for me wasn't going to offer any comfort. "What do we do?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't look outside," Jake muttered, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Maybe if we don't acknowledge it, it'll leave us alone." But I knew better. Whatever was out there, whatever we had contacted, wasn't leaving. It had found us. We had opened a door that wasn't meant to be opened, and now we were trapped. Mike was pacing again, his footsteps loud in the otherwise dead quiet room. "We can't stay here. We need to run, get as far away from this place as possible." But run where? I thought. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't something we could outrun. It wasn't just a stalker or some guy messing with us. It felt bigger than that, like we had unleashed something that was always watching, always waiting. Suddenly, there was a loud creak from the back of the house, like a door being pushed open. We all froze, turning toward the sound. Jake's face went pale. "No one's back there," he whispered, more to himself than to any of us. "We locked everything." I glanced at my phone, the screen still glowing faintly in my hand. The messages, the constant warnings, flashed through my mind. Whoever or whatever had sent them wasn't just watching us. They were already here. Without thinking, I turned and moved toward the back hallway. The others called after me, their voices barely reaching through the fog of fear clouding my mind. My footsteps echoed through the narrow corridor, each step louder than the last, the creaking of the floorboards matching the frantic beating of my heart. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, the shadows at the far end twisting and warping. My phone buzzed again, but I couldn't bring myself to look. As I reached the door to the back room, I paused. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peeking through the crack. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. "Don't." Sophie's voice came from behind me, shaking. "Please don't." But something compelled me to move forward, like I was being pulled toward whatever was behind the door. My hand closed around the knob, cold and slick with sweat. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark. Darker than it should have been. The small window on the far wall should have let in at least some of the moonlight, but instead, it was like a thick, impenetrable fog had swallowed the space whole. And then, in the corner, I saw it, the shadow from before, the figure that had been standing outside. But now it was closer, huddled in the far corner of the room, its shape too tall, too distorted, its limbs unnaturally long and crooked. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze, cold and invasive, like it was peeling away the layers of my mind. I backed away, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. I stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I finally looked at the screen. "You're too late." The words sent a chill down my spine. I turned back toward the living room, my legs shaky and unsteady. When I got there, I saw the others had huddled together by the front door, their eyes wide with fear. "They're inside," I whispered. "They've been inside the whole time." Mike ran his hands through his hair, pacing again, faster this time. No, this can't be happening. This isn't real. We need to leave. Now." But Jake stepped in front of the door, shaking his head. "If we leave, they'll follow. They want us to run. They're already here. If we leave, they'll..." Bang! A loud, deafening knock rattled the front door, cutting Jake off mid-sentence. It was so strong that the doorframe shook, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. We all jumped back, staring at the door in horror. Another knock followed, louder this time, more insistent. "No one answer it," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "Just stay still." But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, faster, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was getting impatient. The lights in the room flickered, casting eerie, distorted shadows across the walls. Then the knocking stopped again. Silence. Cold, heavy silence. For a brief moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe we had somehow avoided whatever fate was waiting for us. But then, I heard it. A voice. Low, raspy, like it was speaking through the walls themselves. "We're already here." The lights went out. Complete darkness. Sophie let out a small gasp, and I could hear Mike muttering something under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. The only sound was the rapid beating of my heart and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of static in the air. And then I felt it, cold fingers brushing the back of my neck. I spun around, holding up my phone's light, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the shadows stretching impossibly long in every direction. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone, something, had touched me. The static in the air grew louder, like an old TV tuned to a dead channel, and then my phone buzzed one last time. With shaking hands, I unlocked it, the screen flickering in the dark. The message was simple. One word. Run. Without thinking, I bolted for the door, yanking it open and stumbling out into the cold night air. The others followed close behind, not asking questions, just running as fast as they could. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, panting, gasping for breath, our hearts racing. I glanced back at the house, half expecting to see the shadow standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, empty house, the lights flickering faintly inside. We piled into the car and Jake floored it, speeding down the empty road. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that whatever we had contacted wasn't done with us. And as my phone buzzed again, another message flashing across the screen, I realized the horrible truth. We were never going to escape. They would always be watching. Always. The car was silent as we sped down the highway, headlights cutting through the darkness. No one spoke. We were too shaken, too scared, barely holding on to the hope that we had escaped whatever had been following us. But deep down, we all knew. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. My phone buzzed again, the vibration cutting through the stillness like a knife. I didn't want to look. Every message so far had been worse than the last, each one dragging us further into this nightmare. But I couldn't ignore it. With trembling hands, I unlocked the screen and stared at the message. "You can't run forever." My chest tightened. I didn't say anything to the others, but I could feel my pulse quickening. They must have seen the look on my face because Sophie leaned forward from the back seat. "What is it? What did they say?" I hesitated, but before I could answer, Jake slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a stop in the middle of the road, tires skidding on the asphalt. My heart lurched as the car came to a halt. "Jake, what the hell?" Mike shouted. Jake didn't respond right away. He just stared ahead, his eyes wide with terror, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Slowly, I turned to see what he was looking at. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure, dark and featureless, just like before. It didn't move. It just stood there, blocking the road, as if it had been waiting for us all along. Its shadow stretched out impossibly long across the pavement, twisting in the beams of our headlights. "We're not safe," Jake muttered under his breath. "We're not safe anywhere." I glanced at my phone again, dreading what might come next. Another buzz, another message. "Turn back." The figure remained motionless, but its presence was suffocating. I could feel it pressing down on us, the weight of its gaze, like it knew we had nowhere left to run. It was as if we had walked right into its trap. "What do we do?" Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. She looked like she was on the verge of tears, her hands shaking as she clutched her seatbelt. "We can't just sit here." I opened my mouth to say something, anything. But before I could respond, the car radio crackled to life. A low hum filled the air, followed by static. It wasn't playing music or picking up a station. It was like we had tuned into something other. And then a voice came through. "We warned you." It wasn't a human voice. It was distorted, garbled, like it was being transmitted from somewhere far away, somewhere we couldn't reach. The words were drawn out, echoing in the confined space of the car, filling it with dread. Jake snapped out of his trance and slammed the car into reverse, speeding backward as fast as he could. The figure in the road didn't move. It just watched as we retreated, its shape disappearing into the darkness as we sped away. "Where are we going?" Mike shouted, panic setting in. "We can't just keep running." "I don't know," Jake yelled, his voice cracking. "Anywhere but here." But we all knew it didn't matter. Wherever we went, they would follow. They had always been watching, waiting. This wasn't something we could escape by driving faster or hiding out. It was like they were a step ahead of us, no matter what we did. The car sped down the road, the trees on either side blurring past us, but the air inside felt tighter, colder. My phone buzzed again, and this time I knew I couldn't ignore it. "It's time to stop running." I showed the message to the others, my stomach twisting in knots. Sophie let out a soft sob, covering her face with her hands. Mike sat back, his head resting against the seat, eyes closed like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. And then Jake's phone rang. We all jumped. No one had been expecting that. The sound was jarring, a harsh reminder that something was still out there, still trying to reach us. Jake glanced at the screen, his face going pale. "No number," he whispered. "It's them." "Don't answer it," Sophie said, her voice desperate. But it was too late. Jake's hand moved on its own, as if compelled by some unseen force, and he pressed the button to answer. He held the phone up to his ear, his face contorting as he listened. We all waited in tense silence, the air thick with fear. I could hear the faintest sound of something coming through the phone, but I couldn't make out what it was. It wasn't words. It was more like a hum, or a low, droning sound, like something not meant for human ears. Jake's expression changed. His face went slack, his eyes wide and glassy. He looked like he was in a trance, like whatever was on the other end of the line had taken hold of him. "Jake?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What are they saying?" He didn't answer. He just dropped the phone, his hands falling limp into his lap. And then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he spoke. "They're here." The car engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered out, plunging us into total darkness. Panic surged through me as I reached for the door handle, ready to run, but something held me back. And then I saw it. Outside the car, the shadows were moving. Not just one figure this time, but several. Dark shapes emerging from the trees, surrounding us on all sides. They moved in unison, slow and deliberate, their forms twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as they closed in, their eyes, if they even had eyes, locked on us. My phone buzzed one last time. "It's over." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Sophie was sobbing now, her voice barely audible over the low hum that filled the air, the same hum that had come through Jake's phone. The figures were right outside the car now, pressed up against the windows, their faces, or what passed for faces, pressed against the glass. I could feel their presence in my mind, pushing, probing, like they were looking for something. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of the car doors unlocking on their own. And then, nothing. We had opened the door. We had asked for the truth, and now we were theirs.